All right, let's jump right in. Today we're tackling a big one. A really, really big one. We're talking about one of the most influential and, yeah, controversial economics books of the entire 20th century. I'm talking about Milton Friedman's 1962 classic, Capitalism and Freedom. This is a book that didn't just make waves. It laid out a vision so radical it ended up reshaping politics for decades.
And Friedman, right from the get-go, he does not pull any punches. He kicks things off with this incredibly stark observation. His whole starting point is that for most of human history, things have been pretty bleak. He's saying that freedom, well, it isn't our natural state. It's not the default setting for society. No, for him, it's this incredibly fragile, super rare and precious thing, an exception to the rule that has to be constantly fought for and protected.
So that leads right into the big question, the one that drives his entire book. If freedom is so rare and fragile, how do we protect it? What kind of system gives it the best possible chance to actually survive and, hopefully, even grow? That's the puzzle he's trying to solve.
So Friedman's answer, well, it was provocative back then, and trust me, it's still being debated like crazy today. His big thesis is this: economic freedom isn't just some nice bonus you get alongside political freedom. Nope. He says it's an essential prerequisite. You can't have political freedom, he argues, unless you first have economic freedom. They're totally linked. You just can't have one without the other.
Okay, so what's the engine that drives this freedom? Well, for Friedman, it's a system he calls competitive capitalism. And we got to be really clear here. When he says that, he is not talking about a system where the government picks winners and losers or props up its favorite companies. Not at all. He's talking about a society that's basically organized through millions and millions of voluntary private deals between people, all happening in a genuinely free market.
And this is where his argument gets really concrete and frankly pretty compelling. He makes the case that when you separate economic power from political power, you create this incredibly important check on the government. Just think about the examples he uses. You had Winston Churchill, who couldn't get on the state-run BBC to warn about Hitler because his views were too controversial for the government at the time. But then, look at the US during the McCarthy era. You had people getting blacklisted by the government, but because there was a private market, because the government didn't control all the jobs, they could still find work. See the difference? If the government is the only employer, how can you possibly speak out against it? You can't. Dissent becomes economically impossible.
Okay, so if the free market is supposed to do most of the work, that begs a pretty big question, right? What's left for the government to actually do? And this brings us to Friedman's idea of its role, which is, well, very limited, but also very, very important.
So, first things first, we need to clear something up, and this is crucial for understanding him. When Friedman calls himself a liberal, he's not using the word the way we do in America today. Not even close. He's reaching back to the original 19th century meaning of the word, which was all about individual freedom and less government. It's much, much closer to what we'd now call libertarian or classical liberal. It's pretty much the exact opposite of the modern American definition, which usually implies more state intervention.
So in Friedman's world, the government basically has three main jobs. That's it. First, it's the umpire. Its job is to enforce the rules of the game, preserve law and order, make sure people honor their contracts, and protect property rights. Second, it's got to provide a stable monetary system so the economy can function smoothly. And third, it only steps in for very specific exceptions, what he calls neighborhood effects. The classic example is pollution, like a factory dumping waste into a river. That's a case where one person's actions are harming others, and it's really tough for the free market to solve that on its own. That's it. That's the list.
And this right here really gets to the heart of why he wants the government's role to be so small. Friedman's belief is that real progress, all the great stuff, major scientific breakthroughs, incredible art, new industries, it doesn't come from a government committee. It comes from individual genius, from weird ideas, from a diversity of thought. He warns that when you let a centralized government take over, it just replaces all that amazing, chaotic progress with, in his words, uniform mediocrity.
All right, so that's the big idea. But how does this actually play out in the real world? Friedman doesn't just stay up in the clouds with theory. He gets right down into the weeds and applies these principles to some very specific and, very controversial parts of our lives.
So let's start with a big one: education. He asks this fundamental question that is just as heated today as it was back then. What exactly should the government's role be when it comes to schooling our kids?
So his solution was what we now know as the school voucher system. It was a pretty radical idea at the time. Instead of the government running all the schools itself, he said, why not give parents a voucher? Basically, a check for a certain amount of money for each kid. Then, the parents could take that voucher and use it at any approved school they wanted, whether it was public or private. And what was the point of all this? The goal was to force schools to compete for students, to give parents real choice, and to spark innovation. To make education work more like a market for any other service.
And believe me, he does not stop with education. He was just getting started. In the book, he actually lists 14 different things that governments do all the time, which he argues are totally unjustified. And the list is wild. It includes everything from setting prices for farmers, to rent control, to setting a minimum wage. He even goes after things like national parks and the government's monopoly on delivering the mail. It just goes to show you how deep his critique went and how truly radical his vision for a limited government really was.
Okay, let's get ready, because we've now arrived at what is probably the single most famous and, let's be honest, infamous argument in the entire book. We're talking about his take on the purpose of business.
This quote just lays it all out there, doesn't it? For Friedman, the idea that a business should have a social responsibility is just wrong. He argues that the only social responsibility of a business is to make as much money as possible for its shareholders, period. As long as it's playing by the rules, engaging in open and free competition, not committing fraud, its one and only job is to increase its profits.
I mean, he doesn't just disagree with the idea of corporate social responsibility, he calls it a fundamentally subversive doctrine. That's some seriously strong language. So why? Why subversive?
Well, it's because it raises this massive question for him. If a business leader is supposed to have a social responsibility, who gets to decide what that is? Who appoints the CEO as the expert on fighting inflation or saving the environment? Friedman's point is that this basically turns unelected business executives into unofficial government agents. They're using other people's money, the shareholders' money, to achieve social goals, but they have no democratic right to do that. That, he says, is the job of the government we elect, not some random CEO.
It's pretty wild to think that when this book first came out, these ideas were considered way out there, like totally on the fringe. But fast forward a couple of decades, and they had traveled from the edges of economic theory right into the halls of power, shaping policy around the globe.
I mean, look at this timeline. It really tells the story. In '62, the book drops, and crickets. The mainstream press pretty much ignores it. But then the '70s happen, and people start to really notice that things like central planning in the Soviet Union and China just aren't working. Suddenly, by the 1980s, you have leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan getting elected on platforms that sound like they were lifted straight from the pages of this book. And then, of course, in 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, and for a lot of people, that felt like the ultimate I told you so moment for Friedman's ideas.
What's really interesting, though, is what Friedman himself thought about all this. He didn't really think the world changed because his arguments were so brilliant. He actually said that the shift happened because of cold, hard reality. People saw with their own eyes that big government and socialist experiments were failing. And it was that failure, he believed, that finally created an audience that was willing to listen to what he had to say.
So that's where we land. The book leaves us with this massive, powerful question, and it's just as urgent today as it was back in 1962. When we're facing all these huge, complex, modern challenges, everything from climate change to global health crisis, is Friedman's central idea right? Is that strict separation of economic and political power the ultimate guardian of our freedom? Or is it a dangerous idea that's just too simple for the complicated world we live in? That is the debate that Capitalism and Freedom started, and it's one that's nowhere near finished.